Native plants provide habitat for animals. It's recognizable habitat. When the bird's flying over, they know what a golden currant looks like and they stop and eat. It provides shelter, it provides food. So, in a very small way, backyard landscapes provide habitat. I essentially consider a green bluegrass lawn is the equivalent ecologically of a parking lot. It's not habitat to anything. It uses tons of water. While it has a functional and an aesthetic place in human culture, large amounts of it are virtually converting what could be habitat for animals and bugs and other creatures to something that is only used by human beings. One of the big issues with sod-forming landscapes like you see all around you here is that in addition to the water use, there's a great deal of maintenance that goes on in those landscapes, and oftentimes a great deal of chemical use. Both fertilizers, which are derived from natural gas by and large, and are water soluble and run off into the water eventually and can pollute streams. And then pesticides and herbicides, which are very toxic chemicals and have been known to cause birth defects, cancer, and other really dangerous situations. Native landscapes don't need any of those. We have not used any chemical fertilizers on this property, and we won't. If fertilization is necessary for some reason, we use just straight compost. That compost is made with ground up green refuse from the dump and mixed with local manure. But by and large, these plants don't need that. They are adapted to grow in nutrient poor, gravelly soils by and large. That's what we have up in the mountains here. That's what exists is down on in the valley floors, which 20,000 years ago were glacial outwash plains. By and large, they just don't need the type of fertilizers that both lawns and conventional perennial gardens would need. Nor do they really need long-term maintenance on the scale that those types of conventional landscapes need. Grass is a high water plant. Generally speaking, in this climate, it requires 18 gallons per square foot per year. On this size landscape, which is approximately 5,000 square feet, if this was all sod lawn, would require almost 90,000 gallons of water a year. We expect to utilize between 8 and 10 when it's fully mature. You can trace the historical fascination with grass all the way back to England and to the early landscape architects in the East that were creating what back there was park-like settings. And the English grass obsession was really appropriate for England in a sense because it rains enough there to have grass. And they had sheep out munching it down in the big estates, and that translated over to this country and other countries and eventually got adopted by the kind of every person on the street back in the 40s and 50s and is essentially continued. There's also a convenience factor in the sense, when areas get disturbed and people don't quite know what to do, it's a simple solution. Just spread some grass seed and water it, mow it down once a week. There are some practical nice things about grass, which, if you want your kids to play on and so forth. And we don't never put grass in our landscapes. We have lawns in almost all of our landscapes. They're just small lawns. They're appropriate sized lawns. They're separated on the irrigation system. And there's obviously different kinds of grass which are much more drought tolerant. This is a fescue lawn. It's a little patchy. We've got to do a little bit of work on it, but it's a Idaho fescue, native fescue. It could survive with no water whatsoever. It would get brown like any other grass if it wasn't watered, but the next spring it would look just like this. It's a cool season grass, which means it greens up when it gets cooler and wetter. It's a bunch grass, so you can see if you look carefully that there are, it's not like a sod forming grass where it's a perfect mat of grasses. There are sod forming native grasses, and if you want to let it go to seed, you can let it go to seed and it'll look like the front. If you want a lawn, you mow it down and it acts as a lawn. It works just fine. There's any number of grasses that will work very well for lawns that are not conventional Kentucky bluegrass. This is an example of how, let's say you have a half an acre on your property. If it's in a dry place like this where you don't get rain in the summer, you can seed it in the fall and it'll germinate in the spring. We seeded just to suppress the weeds. It's mostly native wheatgrasses and some fescue. You know, we mowed it to suppress the weeds. It hasn't been watered this year. That's a simple treatment that you could use on a big area, would cost very little money. Once it's established, doesn't need to be watered at all. And you know, if you were to allow it to go to seed, you would be looking at this kind of type of seed heads, very similar to what's going on over here. That is a, you know, much better solution to having a water intensive lawn on that area, unless for some reason you need that lawn. I think that we need to put in place every little piece of the puzzle that we can possibly do that will reduce water use, because we're looking at a drier planet potentially, minimize chemical use because we're finding out that those chemicals are dangerous to people, to children especially, and change the way we consider beauty or what is beautiful to include how ecologically sustainable it is. Nothing is beautiful if it all collapses around our ears. I think that oftentimes convention, status quo gets established in a place and people just, you know, just go along with it essentially. They don't really know that there's another option perhaps. The other options are a little bit riskier initially. I've had to deal with all of these issues over the last 25 years. And, you know, I would have had a much bigger business if I'd gone the conventional route. But I find this much more fascinating and interesting to explore than just doing that kind of rote thing over and over again.